You think a blockade means soldiers, checkpoints, guns pointed across a line. This one had almost none of that. In the summer of 1948, the Soviet Union tried to starve 2 million people out of a city using nothing but closed gates and a shut-off switch. And the United States, Britain, and France answered not with an army, but with the largest sustained airlift in human history. No shots were fired, no border was crossed by force. And by most serious historical accounts, it's one of the closest the world came to a third global war without either side ever declaring one. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single city ended up stranded inside enemy territory, why the sky turned out to be the one door nobody had thought to lock, who actually ran the operation that saved it, and the small, almost accidental gesture that turned a military standoff into one of the most human stories of the entire Cold War. Start with the map, because the map is the whole problem. When Germany surrendered in 1945, the Allies didn't just carve the country into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. They did the same thing to Berlin, splitting the capital into 4 sectors of its own. That would be a normal enough arrangement, except for one detail that made the whole thing a ticking clock from day one. Berlin itself sat more than 100 miles inside the Soviet zone. West Berlin wasn't a city on the edge of the Western world. It was an island, a free, Western-run island, sitting in the middle of Soviet-controlled territory, entirely dependent on rail lines, roads, and canals that all ran through land Stalin controlled. For the first few years, that arrangement held, mostly because nobody tested it, but the ground underneath it was already shifting. By 1947, the wartime alliance between the Soviets and the West had curdled into something closer to open rivalry. The United States had rolled out the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars in reconstruction aid for a shattered Europe, explicitly offered to the Soviet Zone too, and just as explicitly rejected by Stalin, who saw it as an economic leash. Washington had already committed on paper to a policy of containment, stopping Soviet influence from spreading any further, full stop. Neither side was hiding what it thought of the other anymore. Berlin just happened to be the one place on the map where both sides' territory touched directly. Inside a city, neither one was willing to fully hand over. The 4-power governing body running Germany together, the Allied Control Council, had already collapsed by the time any of this reached Berlin directly. In March 1948, the Soviet representative walked out of a session over disagreements about Western Zone policy and simply never came back, ending 4-power cooperation over Germany as a functioning system months before a single road was closed. So when people frame the blockade as the opening shot of the Cold War in Europe, that's not quite right either. It was closer to the moment the argument that had already been happening for 2 years finally stopped being an argument and became a physical wall between 2 visions of what post-war Germany was supposed to be. Then, in the spring of 1948, the Western Allies did something Stalin had been dreading. They moved to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, across their occupation zones, including West Berlin, without Soviet agreement. To the Soviets, this wasn't bureaucratic housekeeping. It looked like the first concrete step towards stitching the Western zones into an independent capitalist West German state, permanently splitting the country Stalin still hoped to keep unified under Soviet influence, or at minimum, neutral and disarmed. Stalin's answer came on June 24, 1948. Soviet authorities shut down every road, rail line, and canal route running into West Berlin. Overnight, the 2 million people living in the western sectors of the city had no way to bring in food, coal, or medicine by land. The Soviets even cut electricity supplied from power plants in their sector, blaming vague, unspecified technical difficulties, the kind of technical difficulty that happens to start on exactly the day you want a city to starve. Here's the first thing most people get wrong about what happened next. This wasn't really a siege of a city under attack. There was no shelling, no invasion, no military assault on West Berlin at all. It was closer to a hostage situation conducted entirely through infrastructure. Cut the supply lines, wait, and let starvation and cold do the rest of the work without a single soldier having to fire anything. which meant the Western Allies had a genuinely brutal decision in front of them. General Lucius Clay, the US military governor in Germany, initially floated sending an armed convoy straight down the Autobahn to force the roads back open, which, if the Soviets didn't back down, could have started an actual shooting war in the middle of a continent still cratered from the last one. It was the kind of option that solves a problem by potentially causing a much bigger one. And this wasn't a theoretical fear. Just weeks before the blockade began, on April 5, 1948, a Soviet Yak fighter buzzing a British civilian airliner on approach to Berlin's Gartow airfield clipped it mid-air, killing everyone aboard both aircraft. It's remembered as the Gartow air disaster, and it happened before Stalin had cut off a single road. That's the temperature this entire crisis was already running at. Armed aircraft from two nuclear-adjacent superpowers, sharing the same crowded airspace over the same city, with no shooting war officially underway, and no guarantee one wouldn't start by accident. An armed convoy rolling down a Soviet-controlled Autobahn wasn't a hypothetical risk. It was the same risk that had already killed people once, just moved from the sky to the ground. Instead, someone looked up. Buried in the 1945 Four-Power Agreement, the same paperwork that had divided Germany in the first place, were three narrow air corridors, each about 20 miles wide, connecting West Germany to Berlin. They existed for routine occupation traffic. Nobody had built them as a loophole. But Stalin had sealed every road, every railway, every canal, and left the one route running straight over his own head completely open, because closing it meant shooting down Allied aircraft and triggering the war he was trying to avoid without provoking. He'd locked every ground-level door in the building and left the skylight wide open. So on June 26, 1948, just 2 days after the blockade began, American cargo planes started landing at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin. The operation would come to be called Operation Vittles by the Americans and Operation Plainfare by the British. Nobody involved expected it to last more than a few weeks. Feeding and fueling an entire modern city by air, indefinitely, had never been attempted at this scale in the history of aviation. Think about what that actually required. West Berlin needed something in the neighborhood of 4,500 tons of supplies a day just to hold on. Food, medicine, and above everything else, coal. Because winter in Berlin is not gentle, and 2 million people without heating fuel is its own kind of catastrophe. Coal is heavy, dense, and about the least glamorous cargo imaginable to fly in by the ton, day after day, for months. The early weeks were genuinely chaotic. Planes stacked up waiting to land, schedules were loose, and the whole operation ran on improvisation rather than precision. That changed in July 1948, when the Americans brought in a general named William Tunner, a man who had already run an impossible airlift once before, flying supplies over the Himalayas into China during the Second World War, a route so brutal pilots called it the Hump. Tunner looked at Berlin's airlift and saw exactly the kind of undisciplined operation that gets people killed. So he rebuilt it from the ground up. Strict instrument flying procedures, regardless of weather, fixed altitudes and fixed intervals between aircraft, standardized approach patterns, and crews that stayed inside their planes during unloading instead of wandering off, fed coffee and food brought out to them on the tarmac instead. Berlin's airlift stopped looking like an emergency response and started looking like a factory line that happened to be several thousand feet in the air. The turnaround procedure alone is worth pausing on. Under Tunner's system, a loaded plane touched down, taxied to its unloading spot, and had a ground crew waiting, not strolling over, waiting, to start pulling cargo the second the engines cut. Pilots weren't allowed to leave the cockpit. Paperwork was handled through the window. A mobile snack truck, staffed in part by German women, hired specifically for the job, brought food out to the crew rather than routing them through a terminal. The entire cycle, land, unload, refuel, take off again, was often finished in under 30 minutes. Multiply that by hundreds of flights a day, every day, and you get something that looked less like an emergency relief mission and more like the most disciplined delivery route in the history of aviation, except the packages were coal and the customers were an entire city. Ask yourself what that actually took to pull off. Every single plane, every single day, landing on a fixed schedule, in weather that would ground ordinary air traffic, because we'll fly when it clears up, wasn't an option when a city was counting on that cargo to make it through the week. And Berlin's weather did not cooperate. The city sits low, flat, and prone to thick fog, and the winter of 1948 into 1949 delivered some of the worst flying conditions crews had ever worked in. Visibility dropping low enough that pilots occasionally couldn't see the runway until seconds before touchdown. The airlift leaned hard on a relatively new technology called ground-controlled approach, where a radar operator on the ground talked a pilot down blind, reading out heading and altitude corrections over the radio, in a steady, practiced monotone until wheels hit tarmac. It worked. Mostly. Planes still went down, engine failures, weather, simple exhaustion catching up with exhausted crews flying the same 18-minute corridor for the 100th time that month. And not every crew that took off landed again. This was not, in fact, safe. The math kept escalating from there. Early flights used C-47 Skytrains, each hauling around 3.5 tons, barely a dent in what the city needed. As the operation matured, the workhorse became the C-54 Skymaster, carrying roughly 10 tons a trip, landing at Tempelhof, at Gartow in the British sector, and eventually at a brand new airfield built at Tegel, constructed by Berliners themselves, including thousands of women, since so many German men of working age were dead, missing, or still in prisoner of war camps, working in shifts around the clock to build a runway their own city needed to survive. Here's the second major thing people get wrong. They picture this as a purely military standoff, two governments posturing with hardware, while the actual people of Berlin stay background noise in their own crisis. That's backwards. Berliners weren't bystanders in this. They were building runways. They were rationing what little they had left. And they were the ones standing at the edge of Tempelhof airfield, day after day, watching the planes come in, because those planes were the only reason they were still eating. That's the refrain worth holding on to for the rest of this video. No bullets, no tanks, just airplanes, on a schedule, refusing to stop. There's a piece of this most retelling skip entirely, and it undercuts one of the laziest assumptions people make about the whole crisis, that West Berliners were simply desperate, waiting to be rescued, with no real choice in the matter. They had a choice, actually, and the Soviets made sure they knew it. All through the blockade, East Berlin authorities ran a standing offer. Any West Berliner willing to register for food rations in the Soviet sector could eat normally. No waiting on airplanes, no rationing, no coal departments. It would have been the easy way out. And the overwhelming majority of West Berlin's roughly 2 million residents simply didn't take it. Reliable estimates put registrations in the range of a few percent of the population at most. That's not the behavior of a population being rescued against its will. That's a city actively choosing which side of an ideological line it wanted to stand on, in the middle of winter, on an empty stomach. Which is worth sitting with for a second. The airlift wasn't just an engineering answer to a supply problem. It was a bet that people would rather endure real hardship on the side of the choice they'd made than take the easy exit being dangled in front of them. And Berliners spent 11 months proving that bet correct. That political defiance had a face too, and it belongs in this story. Ernst Reuter had been elected mayor of Berlin by the city council in 1947, and the Soviets, who still held a veto over anyone governing in what was technically a jointly administered city, simply refused to let him take office. So Reuter became something stranger than a mayor, an elected leader with no formal authority, who turned into the loudest political voice West Berlin had. In September 1948, with the blockade in its third month and no end in sight, Reuter stood in front of the ruined Reichstag and spoke to a crowd historians estimate at around 300,000 people, appealing directly past his own government to the wider world. Peoples of the world, look upon this city and see that you should not, cannot abandon this city and this people. It wasn't a speech about airplanes or tonnage figures. It was a mayor with no real power, asking the rest of the planet not to look away, Which brings us to the part of this story that almost never makes the history textbook version. In July 1948, a young American pilot named Gail Halvorson was in Berlin on a rest day, filming planes landing at Tempelhof, when he noticed a group of children gathered at the airfield fence, watching. He walked over and talked with them. They weren't asking him for chocolate or asking for anything really. What struck him was that they weren't asking for much of anything at all, after years of war and now a blockade on top of it. He had 2 sticks of gum in his pocket. He broke them in half and handed them through the fence and watched the kids who didn't get a piece carefully smell the wrapper anyway. He told them that on his next flight over, he'd drop them more, and that they'd know which plane was his because he'd wiggle the wings before he dropped it. Then he went back to his squadron, tied a handful of candy bars to handkerchief parachutes, and dropped them out of the cockpit window on his next approach into Tempelhof. Word spread. More kids showed up at the fence every day, watching for the wing wiggle. Halvorson's commanding officers eventually found out, and instead of shutting it down, they backed it. It grew into an official effort called Operation Little Vittles, with other pilots joining in, and American candy manufacturers and school kids back home mailing in tons of candy and homemade parachutes to keep it going. Berliners gave the whole operation its own nickname too, Rosinenbomber, Raisin Bombers, a term that started with Halvorson's candy drops and eventually got applied to the entire airlift fleet, coal and all. There's something almost defiant about a city under blockade choosing to name the planes keeping it alive after dried fruit, rather than after weapons or rescue. It's the same instinct as Reuter's speech, just quieter, refusing to let the crisis define the tone of how you talk about your own survival. None of that changed the tonnage numbers. It didn't move a single extra ton of coal, but it did something the airlift's cargo manifests couldn't. It turned an abstract Cold War standoff, playing out in newspaper headlines about zones and currencies and occupation rights, into something people on both sides of the Atlantic could actually feel. A very small kindness, delivered on a schedule, from the same air corridor keeping an entire city alive. If a story like this, where the real history turns out stranger and more human than the textbook version, is the kind of thing you want more of, liking the video helps this reach the people who genuinely enjoy digging into it with you. Now back to how this thing actually ended. By early 1949, the airlift had settled into a rhythm nobody thought was possible 7 months earlier. And on April 16, 1949, Easter Sunday, the operation staged what crews nicknamed the Easter Parade, a full 24-hour push to see exactly how much the airlift could move if everything ran at maximum tempo. Planes landed at a rate of roughly 1 every 90 seconds around the clock, and by the time the day was done, crews had flown in nearly 13,000 tons of cargo in a single 24-hour stretch, more than double a normal day's delivery. It wasn't really about the coal that particular day. It was a message aimed squarely at Moscow. This isn't straining to hold on. This can run indefinitely, and it can run harder than you think. Here's where most retellings flatten into a single tidy cause, and the truth is messier than that. It wasn't only the airplanes that ended this, and it wasn't only backroom diplomacy either. It was both, running at the same time, each one making the other more effective. While Tunner's crews were setting tonnage records over Berlin, a quieter negotiation was unfolding 4,000 miles away, in the hallways of the United Nations in New York. The US ambassador to the UN, Philip Jessup, and his Soviet counterpart, Yakov Malik, had started informally talking. The story goes that Jessup simply noticed Malik wasn't at a session and asked after him in a hallway, and the conversation that followed quietly became the real channel for ending the crisis, entirely outside the formal diplomatic process. By early 1949, those hallway conversations had turned into genuine negotiations over how to lift the blockade without either side looking like it had blinked first. So here's the third correction, and it's really a correction of the correction people think they already know. Most assume Stalin lifted the blockade because the Soviets simply ran out of patience. Full stop. End of story. The fuller truth is that he ran out of leverage on 2 fronts simultaneously. The airlift wasn't failing. It was still getting faster, still getting bigger, and the Easter parade had just proven it had capacity to spare, which meant starving West Berlin into surrender was no longer a realistic bet. And at the same time, the Jessup Malek Channel had quietly built him an exit that didn't require admitting the blockade had failed outright. Take away either piece, the planes or the diplomacy, and this likely drags on much longer, or ends far worse. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union reopened the roads, railways, and canals into West Berlin. The blockade was over, 11 months after it began. The airlift itself didn't stop immediately. Planners kept flights running for several more months, through the end of September 1949, stockpiling supplies as insurance against the Soviets trying the same maneuver twice. By the time it wound down, the numbers were almost absurd. Something in the range of 278,000 flights, delivering roughly 2.3 million tons of cargo, the overwhelming majority of it coal, into a city that had been written off as indefensible less than a year earlier. It wasn't free. Around 101 people, American, British, and German, died in crashes and accidents over the course of the operation, a real cost behind a story that's often told as a bloodless victory. Here's the fourth and last correction, and it's the one with the biggest afterlife. This was never really a fight over one city. It was a test, the first major test of whether the Western powers would actually back their new, half-formed alliance with real commitment when it costs something. And the timing here is almost too on the nose. NATO was formally founded in April 1949, while the airlift was still in full swing, a direct response to exactly the kind of pressure Stalin had just applied to Berlin. Within the year, Germany itself formally split into two separate countries, the Federal Republic in the west, the German Democratic Republic in the east, a division that would hold for the next 4 decades. The Berlin blockade didn't just fail to stop that outcome. It's a big part of why that outcome happened at all, and happened as fast as it did. You think a blockade means soldiers, checkpoints, guns pointed across a line. This one was fought with cargo manifests and landing schedules instead. No bullets, no tanks, just airplanes, on a schedule, refusing to stop, for almost a full year, until the side that started it quietly opened the gate it had slammed shut. If you want more moments like this one, where the Cold War almost turned hot and didn't, and where the actual mechanics of how that happened are stranger than the summary you got in school, subscribing means you won't miss the next one, and I'd genuinely like to know in the comments which Cold War flashpoint you'd want covered next, because there's no shortage of candidates. One last thing, because it's too good to leave for another video. Gail Halvorson's original wing wiggle gesture didn't end when the airlift did. He kept in contact with Berlin for the rest of his life, returned for anniversary events for decades afterward, and in 1970 an elementary school in Berlin was named after him. Candy manufacturers and schoolchildren who mailed in parachutes during Operation Little Vittles never met the kids on the other end of those drops. And decades later, some of those same Berlin children, by then adults, tracked Halvorson down, just to say thank you. A 90-year-old man in a flight jacket, still occasionally wiggling the wings of small planes at air shows well into his old age, remained for the rest of his life the most famous uncle that most of them had never actually met. The airplanes themselves got a memorial too, though it's easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. Outside the former Tempelhof Airport stands a sculpture Berliners call the Hungerhake, the hunger rake, 3 curved prongs sweeping upward from a single base, each one representing one of the 3 air corridors that kept the city alive. Matching monuments stand at Frankfurt and at Celle, the airfields in the west where those same flights first took off, so that the route itself is memorialized at both ends, not just where it landed. Tempelhof stopped operating as an airport in 2008 and is now a public park, where Berliners jog, picnic, and cycle down the same runways their grandparents once watched candy fall onto. Most of them by now don't look up expecting anything at all.